Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you're doing well, and welcome to another Solo Fall Baits video. Yes, I decided to change my channel name ever so slightly, and also it has been a little while since I posted anything on the channel. Sorry about that, but I think today's video is going to make up for that wait, because this is by far the most ambitious project that I have ever undertaken, and it has actually taken me 6 months of actual fabrication time to get to this point where I can just sit down and start editing the video that you're watching right now. So, without further ado, this is the giant northern pike swim bait. Let's do this. Alright, let's tackle this beast. So what I have here is a template that I drew a little bit earlier to this piece of paper. Well, actually 2 pieces of paper because the damn thing is so big. And I'm just going to use that to draw the outlines of the pike into this piece of basswood that I have here, which is 4 centimeters thick. Unlike what I would usually do, I decided to poke the eye socket pilot hole right now, because, well, why not? And after that we're going to head out to the miter saw and chop a little bit off from this piece of basswood to make this a little bit more manageable for me to work on the bandsaw later on. And now we're off to the bandsaw, and actually I have to say that cutting basswood is very satisfying. This wood is really soft from what I'm normally used to, which is like harder timbers like maple or maybe oak or stuff like that. So this went very, very smoothly. Now that the silhouette has been cut, I'm just going to smooth out my handiwork, air quotes, and make it a little bit more nicer. And I'm just going to use my disc sander slash belt sander combo to do that. Next we're gonna mark and draw the center line, and the flattest place in my shop is on top of the table saw, so I ended up using that. By the way guys, if you thought that this video is long, I actually have an extended version up on my Patreon at the moment, which is 1 hour and 52 minutes long. Yes, 1 hour and 52 minutes of pure adulterated solo fall baits epicness. Yeah, let's go with that. Anyways, if you want, you can just head out to my Patreon and check it out there. I would definitely appreciate that if you did. Alrighty, so next on the do list is to mark where I need to do the cuts for the joints. And starting from the back piece is going to be 5 centimeters long, and going up from there it's going to be 8.7 centimeters long. In case somebody was wondering what sort of measurements I used here, because it's not really visible in the video. Before going ahead and doing the joint cuts, I decided this would be a good time to actually do the slot for the back fin. So that's what we're gonna do next. If you've seen any of my previous videos regarding swim baits or making them, you've noticed that I usually use this kind of a jig to angle the cuts properly when I do it by hand. So I decided to make new pieces because the ones that I have previously were severely lacking in size, and I decided, you know what, it would be a really good idea to make sure that I don't screw up these cuts when I actually start doing them. So here's how the jig actually works. So what you do is you clamp your first piece onto the lure accurately, and then you put your saw blade on top of that, and then you basically sandwich the other piece with that saw blade. And boom, perfect cuts every single time. Here you can see how easy it is to get the cuts absolutely perfect every single time. Alright, so now that the cuts have been made and everything is absolutely perfect, I'm just gonna start rounding off the upper profile, and I'm gonna start by shaping the head of the pike first. And then I'm just going to head out to the belt sander option, and then I'm just going to taper this into a nice pikey shape. And actually I decided not to use any kind of guidelines or anything like that. I just basically know what a pike looks like from catching probably hundreds of thousands of them throughout my life. And I don't think I've ever mentioned, but pike is actually my favorite all-time fish to catch. They are fantastic. So, if any of you out there have ever worked with basswood before, you know that it's kind of annoying to work with when you sand it, because it has this kind of a fuzzy, fibrous feel to it. And I kind of didn't want to deal with that and not use my power tools. And instead, I decided to use my pluck blade to shave and round off the excess wood here. And to be honest, this was actually surprisingly satisfying, because this stuff shaves off like butter. I mentioned a little bit earlier that I don't really like sanding basswood because of the nature how it is, but you kind of have to because of all of the cut marks and shaving marks and whatnot. And what I have here is kind of a homemade vacuum setup where I have just my shop vac vacuuming all of the sawdust and preventing that from going into my lungs, which is always a good thing. Now the pike is nice and smooth, it's time to head out to the danger zone and drill out the eye sockets. Alright, next I'm gonna cut up the template and use that as a stencil to mark out wherever I need to draw kind of guidelines for myself before I start carving out the details. I pretty much always do this, and I've never veered away from it. I guess I could try to freehand these, but I think I'm not at that point yet. But, you know, I oftentimes get asked if I share my templates and stencils and whatnot, and I think you can already see here that I'm pretty much destroying them every single time I make a new lure, so unfortunately I can't. I guess technically I could take a copy of them before I start cutting them up, but that would take the enjoyment for you guys to make your own lure. Alrighty, let's start carving. So, if you've seen any of my other videos, you already know the drill pretty much. So what I do is I follow along those guidelines that I just drew, and I'm gonna use a hobby knife that has a 9mm thick snap-off blade. And like I said, I'm just following along those guidelines first with the blade, and then I go behind those lines and expose the details that way. I've been doing this for so long this way that I'm kind of stuck in my ways. Although I do kind of want to try to do this sort of stuff with a rotary tool. And I actually recently bought myself one of those small little pen sized power carvers. I know that you can do this sort of stuff with a rotary tool. For example, Andrew Garner from Milosh Fishing Lures is famous for doing all of his stuff with a rotary tool. So I know that you can do it. I just actually haven't ever tried to do it with one of those tools. But I think I'm gonna start experimenting this winter and see what happens. Now that I have carved most of the head details, I'm gonna add one more detail that is pretty vital for this lure to look like a pike, which is this kind of like a groove that it has in front of its eyes, which help the pike to hone in on its attack when it's hunting for prey. So the pike and its bigger cousin muskie are pretty much the perfect freshwater predators that mostly, of course, rely on their good eyesight to hunt, but also they have a lot of other instruments around their body to detect vibrations in the water. And one of those instruments is these pores that they have on the side of their faces and on the lower jaw. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to poke a bunch of holes on the lower jaw and on the side of this pike's head to simulate those pores. Next, we're going to head out to the bandsaw and cut some Lexan polycarbonate sheet that is 3 millimeters thick, and we're going to start making the fins. So the pike has two sets of pectoral fins that are slightly different from each other. So I decided to glue these two sets of pectoral fins together to make sure that I keep everything nice and equal. Because of the shape of most of these fins, I was able to use my disc sander to sand off all of the rough edges that occurred from using my bandsaw. And rest of these areas I worked on with a rotary tool. Do you remember those fins that I glued together? Well, now it's time to break them apart, which was pretty easy because I was smart enough to leave the protective film on the Lexan polycarbonate sheets. Alright, so of course we're gonna have to fit the fins into the body of the pike. So that's what we're gonna do next. We're gonna make some slots for the fins. So I'm gonna start off by cutting along the outside of the fin slot with a hobby knife, and then I'm just gonna go in with a homemade chisel and gouge out the rest of the material. And I ended up going probably 1 centimeter deep on pretty much every single fin here so that I would have good adhesion and strength later on. Alright, now we're gonna enter the danger zone again. And I'm gonna drill a bunch of holes here, 5 of them to be exact, to accept lead weights, which are pretty close to 100 grams, almost all of them except one in the front, which is like half of that, so 50 grams. So yeah, this lure is gonna be pretty damn heavy. For the holes I'm gonna do something a little different. From what I would normally do is I would use Bondo or something else to fill up the holes, but instead I decided to use wooden caps from the same exact basswood, which will allow me to carve on the wood caps themselves, because that's the plan that I have here. I'm actually going to carve all around the lure, and this will make them pretty much disappear completely into the rest of the body, which is exactly what I want. Now that I have shaped and fitted the caps on the lure, I'm just going to glue them in with 5-minute epoxy. Yes, I know, shocking, 5-minute epoxy. I don't think there has been a single lure making video from me ever where I haven't used 5-minute epoxy. So it's pretty much a staple on the channel now, I think. But yeah, anyways, I have to note here that it's really important to mark out where the grain of the wood is going so that it will be parallel to the grain that you have on the lure itself. So it's going to be much easier for me to actually shave off the excess wood later on. Once the epoxy has cured, I'm just going to shave off the excess and sand these things flat. Alrighty, next we're gonna carve a stupendous amount of scales. But before I can do any kind of carving, I need to mark out the size of the scales and where they're gonna be. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going along the lateral line and I'm marking with 2mm increments where the scale is gonna start. In order for me to draw an accurate and consistent angle on the scales, I made this little tool a little while ago to help me to do exactly that. I could tell you the angle here, but I would have to kill you, so. That little tool that I had for getting the angles correct is good for a certain point. If I wanted to do the scales around the body like I do, I have to do it freehand. So that's what I'm doing right now. Normally when I do the scales, I do them with a pencil, but since this is going to be a really big lure, I think I have a very high chance of smudging the scales at some point, so I decided to actually use a fine tip permanent marker for that. Because I already weighted the lure, this is pretty heavy to carve, especially when I do it by hand, so I decided to separate the pieces at this point to make it a little bit more manageable for me to actually do the carving around the segments. Next I'm going to carve a copious amount of scales, and this is pretty much exactly the same way I did the head detail, so I go along the edges of the scales first and then go behind them and carve out the detail. And I think it took me around 2.5 weeks of carving the whole thing, which is not too bad considering how many scales I actually had to carve. after those 2.5 weeks, I was happy to do something completely different. So next I moved on to drilling out the hardware holes for the connections, which will be screw eyes. So what I just do is I basically just mark with 2 centimeter increments from up and down, and then transfer that into the other segment and just drill out the holes. Now that I have the hardware holes done and some hardware in them, it's time to seal the lure. And unlike before, I decided to use something different, a polyurethane finish. And I already know from previous experience that woods, softwoods like this, really suck in all of the moisture and liquids really easily. So I think it's really a perfect stuff to use here, because I still want to retain some of the details that I ended up carving here. While the polyurethane was curing, I decided to tackle the fins and start carving those. I started with carving them with a knife, but then I realized, you know what, this is taking too long, so I'm just going to finish it off with a rotary tool, which I did, and even then it took me a fair amount of time to finish this. I think in all, it took me probably 2 weeks. So yeah, that's a fair amount of time, I think. Paw carving those fins was a pretty harrowing experience, to say the least, because I decided to do them freehand without drawing any kinds of outlines or guidelines or anything, which I would normally do. But you know what? You only live once, and actually just wanted to try if I could do it. Anyways, what I started by doing is I airbrushed the fins orange, which is going to be the color of the bones that will be exposed when I carve in between those. And it ended up working actually pretty well, I think. But, you know, just one of those things that I just had to try if I could do it. And like I said, it ended up working out for me, I think. When I was done with the fins, the logical course of action is to move on to the rest of the lure and start painting it. And that's exactly what I did. So I'm going to start by spraying this gold chrome, which is going to be kind of like background highlight color actually. And we're going to start adding colors on top of that. After the gold, I decided to highlight those areas with a darker green to really make them pop. And I did this kind of wash technique where I spray a bunch of paint onto those areas and then just immediately wipe everything off, leaving that paint into the grooves. After that darker green, I decided to start adding some other shades of green around the pike. Mainly on the lower belly and also on the face itself. After that medium olive green, I decided that I wanted to blend it in a little bit better. So I chose this medium yellow to do that. While I was adding that yellow blending, I realized, crap, I made a mistake. What I should have done in the beginning was actually paint the whole body of the pike with that gold first and then go over it with some other colors. But you know what? Sometimes you kind of have to go back to go forward. Now that I have all the segments painted with that golden chrome color, I will actually seal them in with this metallic varnish that I tend to use pretty much only when I do some sort of washing technique, because if you don't do this and you do the wash, you're gonna scrape off your paint, which is obviously not what we want. The reason I wanted to do the seal at this point is that even though I'm technically not doing any kind of wash technique here, and I'm just painting these V-shaped patterns on the scales, is that in case I end up screwing things up and overpaint something, I can just easily wipe it off and the metallic paint is not going to be scraped off underneath. So at this point, all of the sides are pretty much done and I'm fairly happy with how they actually turned out. Actually took me a week and a half to paint the whole thing overall, which is probably the longest time I've ever spent in painting anything. Anything specific, that is. But yeah, I'm just going to use this candy black to highlight some of the scales on the backside, because obviously that's going to be slightly darker than the sides. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a template from this piece of paper, and using the pike as the outlines first, and then I'm going to draw this kind of like a wavy pattern on it that the pike has. I think I could have probably done this with an airbrush free-handed too, but at this point I was like, you know what, I don't want to take any risks and screw something up, so I'm just gonna do it like I've always done it. Now that the template is done, I'm just going to use that to spray that wavy pattern that I was talking about earlier. Next, I'm going to focus on the face and give it a little bit more character with this darker shade of green. And if you ever caught a pike, or you go online and check out photos of pike, and particularly its head, you see that it has a lot of streaks and kind of swirly patterns. And that is what I'm trying to create here by using this stippling technique, where I just shoot small dots of paint around the areas that I think will need some of that, and try to make it look unintentional, which is much more difficult than it sounds, because you end up overdoing things oftentimes, and it's sometimes difficult to just raise up your hands and be like, okay, I'm done. So the northern pike has a lot of variation when it comes to its color, and that's also the case with its pattern that it usually has on the flanks. For example, you have a pike from Italy will look completely different than a pike that you would catch from Northern Europe, for example. So I decided to go what I know the most, which is the Northern European pike, and I'm going to start off by using white. Since I'm going for more of a Northern European variety of pike, a lot of them tend to have this kind of a cool snaky pattern on their backs. Oftentimes it's green, sometimes a little bit brown, but oftentimes it's very subtle. So I'm gonna start with this raw sienna. And now that I have the pattern established on the back, I'm just gonna use this ochre to kind of blend it into the background. When I have done that snaky pattern on the back, I noticed that I'm actually having a lot of empty space here that I feel like I need to fill. So I decided to continue doing a little bit of those swirly patterns and streaks that I was doing earlier on the side of the head of the pike. Next, I decided that I wanted to darken up the back color a little bit more and kind of blend it into the side of the pike as well. And while doing that, I noticed that it actually highlights the snaky pattern that I painted on the back as well pretty nicely. At this point of the painting process, I decided, you know what, I think I'm still going to try to make the blending a little bit more smoother. So I decided to highlight some of the inner parts of the green spots that I just painted here between those snaky patterns to make the blending a little bit more smoother. And I think it was definitely something that I needed to do. So we still have those spots that I painted with white before to fill out and make them blend into the pike much nicer, because obviously I don't think I've ever seen a pike that has white spots, although there could be some of them out there, who knows. Anyways, I didn't want my pike to look like that, so I decided to use some yellow in those areas, because the yellow that I have, or actually the reason why I chose to use white in the background in the first place is that the yellow that I have doesn't really cover anything. So I needed to kind of boost that yellow color with the white, if that makes sense. Now that I had pretty much all of the characteristics of a pike down, I decided to move on to the fins and paint the patterns that they have on those. And again, I decided to do them free-handed because it's a good exercise on trigger control and also your nerve. So I'm almost done painting the pike, but I still need to add a couple of small little details. And first of all, I want to make this look a little bit more fleshier. So I'm adding this squid pink in some of the key areas that I feel like would have this color in them. So now that the some of the key areas that I wanted to flesh out are done, I can move on to some other areas that I wanted to highlight. And those are the gill rays. And I'm going to be using that stippling technique of just shooting small little dots of paint along these edges here, which is honestly pretty difficult. I could have probably used some sort of masking tape or something here to make sure that I don't go over, but thankfully I was accurate enough and didn't make too many mistakes while doing this. And I'm still not done. I still need to blend in some of that stippling that I just did with this yellow. So next we're gonna move on to making the eyes. And what I've done here already is that I've used a hollow punch tool to punch out a couple of eyes from a vinyl sheeting that you can buy from Amazon or probably eBay as well. And I've glued them onto screws to lift them up a little bit from the surface. And I'm just going to start off by adding this gold chrome color in the background first. After the gold, I'm gonna add a generous amount of red along the edges of the eye. Next I'm gonna blend in that red color with some darker Russian brown, and this will make it look a little bit more subtle. So now that the background colors are done, I'm just going to mix up some 5-minute epoxy and try to make sure that I don't get too many bubbles into the mixture. Alright, here's a small little tip for you guys. If you happen to mix epoxy and you do get some small little bubbles into it, sometimes heating it up with a hot air gun will make those bubbles rise to the surface, and you're going to be able to get rid of them pretty easily. Alrighty, next we're going to move on to making the iris, and what I have here is a homemade stencil that I will be using to make that rim that goes around the pupil with this kind of dull gold color. And of course, next we're gonna make the pupil, and the placement of the slightly smaller stencil is pretty vital. So every time I make one eye, I wipe it off and reposition it into the next eye. Okay, now that pretty much everything is done, it's only a matter of actually starting to glue stuff in. So I'm gonna mix up some 5-minute epoxy, and first I'm going to glue in the eyes, and after that I'm going to start gluing in all of the fins. You know, I really gotta say that I had a hard time finding the right placement to all of the parts around the drying wheel to make sure that everything is in balance, because if it's not, my drying wheel has a tendency of skipping a little bit. I think maybe the gears are starting to wear down a little bit. And yeah, I definitely didn't want that to happen, because if that would be the case, I would have an uneven finish. And that would be disastrous. But thankfully I was able to figure out the right spots and even ended up adding a unfinished lure to balance things out. So again, I'm using True Coat epoxy, and I ended up adding 5 layers in total. After a couple of days of curing time, it was finally time to assemble my swim bait. And I'm gonna start off by opening up these screw eye loops ever so slightly so that I can connect them together. And then after that, I'm just going to close those loops, and boom, I have a connection. So now I'm gonna mix up some 5-minute epoxy and actually start screwing in the screw eyes into the lure. So the way that this works is that the first piece, I will actually screw the screw eyes into those, and the opposite side has slightly larger holes than the diameter of the screw eyes, so I can just slide them in. Alright, so now that we have this beast assembled, I'm gonna add some big ass hooks into it too. These are 12/0 hooks. These are pretty much the biggest ones that I was able to find, and unfortunately I had to go to all the way to the US to find these, which is kind of a bummer, but oh well, what can you do? So I'm sure that many of you out there are actually interested in how heavy and how big this thing actually is. So let's check out the weight first. And now let's check out the length. And as you can see, this is a fairly big lure. This is definitely the biggest damn thing I ever done. And who knows, maybe someday I will make something even bigger than this. But I think I can safely say that the next project is going to be a lot smaller than this. And finally, I just wanted to give you guys one last look of all of the details and do a little bit of a pan around the lure. I can't end this video without doing a traditional bathtub test, can I? And as you can see, these two things kind of don't go too well together because of the size of the damn thing. But then again, the person who commissioned this lure from me actually wanted it as a mantle piece more than actual fishable fishing lure, although I did make it as a functioning wall hanger, I guess. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, like the video if you did, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I will see you guys in the next one. I already have a pretty good idea what I'm gonna do.